All right, baby, here we go. It's Friday night and we're screencasting chapter 21 because I forgot to do it on Thursday night. Oh, yeah. That's how we party here in the north side of Chicago on a Friday night. It's getting crunk up in here. So I know some of y'all right now are thinking, hey, man, I can't wait till after I graduate. Maybe then I can party with Mr. Friedrich. But let me remind you, man, I'm not just screencasting chapter 21 tonight. I'm also doing a load of laundry. So before you think about partying with me, you just ask yourself, can I keep up? Yike. You better check yourself before you wreck yourself because this is not just about history. This is also about mathematics. Here we go. Let's start out with a little bit of election math in 1912. What does this all mean up here? What do we got here? Got an elephant divided by a moose, it looks like it. It equals a guy and a donkey. What's up with that? Well, of course, we know the elephant is the symbol of the Republican Party, and the donkey is the symbol of the Democratic Party. What's up with this? Well, this is Teddy Roosevelt, right? Teddy Roosevelt ran as a third party candidate in the 1912 election. And what the political illustrator here is saying is that he ended up dividing the Republican Party because Roosevelt himself used to be a Republican, and that led to a Democratic victory. Is that true? Why, yes, yes, in fact, it is. Teddy Roosevelt became president. Remember, his first term was really the continuation of William McKinley's term because McKinley had been assassinated. Roosevelt was enormously popular, and he took over from McKinley just about a year into McKinley's term. So even before Roosevelt was done with his first term of office, people were already asking him if he would run two times on his own, right? Would he serve two terms of his own? But even during the finishing of McKinley's administration, Roosevelt had already said, no, if I do win re-election, I'll call it a day after that because I'm essentially serving two terms here. Now, as of yet, there was no constitutional prohibition against a president serving more than two terms. There is now. However, there wasn't then. Every president that had served two terms stepped down following the precedent originally set by President George Washington. So, Roosevelt was reelected by a landslide, but then decided to run after William Howard Taft had served a term in office. Now, Taft was Roosevelt's sort of hand-picked successor to the presidency, but Roosevelt saw Taft as being too soft, not energetic enough. Now, that's a hard little bit of judgment to make because nobody maybe was harder or more energetic than Teddy Roosevelt. But Roosevelt did not want to run against Taft and split the Republican Party in 1912, so he ran as an independent party candidate for the Progressive Party, also known as the Bull Moose Party, because Roosevelt himself was known as his nickname, the Bull Moose. What happened then was Roosevelt won actually more votes and more electoral votes than Taft, but they split what would have otherwise been likely the Republican vote by and large, and that led to the Democrat, Woodrow Wilson, being elected. Him with 41% of the vote, a plurality president, not winning a majority, just winning the most votes of anyone else, but more importantly, enough electoral votes to carry the election. So Woodrow Wilson would become the last of our progressive presidents. The first two, of course, being William Howard Taft and Teddy Roosevelt, but in the other order, Roosevelt first and then Taft, both of whom were Republicans. So Wilson was a Democrat, but also a progressive, but also very much in favor, in many ways, of foreign intervention. Roosevelt is a really unique cat. He was born in Virginia in 1856, so just before the Civil War. And the Civil War itself would really shape his worldview. He believed in national self determination. This was a very Southern view in the middle to late 19th century. This was the same time of the world history, for example, when the German states were unifying and becoming Germany, when later the Italian states would unify and become what we know today as Italy, all under the guise of nationalism, people of a similar language, similar religion, similar background, forming a nation because of that cultural connection. And many people in the South saw their story as being essentially the same. Well, Roosevelt grew up in that worldview and believed in self determination of nations. He was also heavily influenced by his father. His father was a Presbyterian minister and was the homeschool schoolmaster for much of young Wilson's early schooling. Wilson's own writing and oratory was really quite soaring. One of his contemporaries called him a phrasocrat, and much of that love of language he gained from his father. Wilson attended Princeton University and would later become president of Princeton University in 1902. From there, he became governor of New Jersey in 1910. This is the progressive era, remember. We know that there was a lot of progressive reform going on in New York, and much of that had also started to enter into New Jersey. Princeton University, by the way, is in New Jersey, in case you didn't know that. That's the connection then between Princeton and New Jersey. And the political party bosses in New Jersey, fearful of the potential for some reform minded progressive to come into office and oust them, as it happened in many other places, convinced Woodrow Wilson to run for governor. Now, their logic was this, right? This was a great front man. He was, the son of a Presbyterian minister. He was the president of Princeton University. He would make the whole shebang of politics in New Jersey look perfectly acceptable. And because he was a political newbite, he'd be easily controllable. Turns out, however, that Woodrow Wilson was not easily controllable. Soon, Wilson began to aggressively reform state politics in New Jersey, removing from office many of the same party bosses who were essentially responsible for getting him to the governorship. Indeed, the political party bosses of New Jersey chose poorly. Here we see Woodrow Wilson on his inauguration day, and some historians will argue that no president was happier to leave the presidency than William Howard Taft. He was a policy wonk, not really comfortable in the public eye. William Howard Taft, though, was an incredibly intelligent individual. He is the only person in U.S. history to serve both in the executive branch as president, and he would, after his presidency, be nominated to the Supreme Court. So he served both at the highest levels of the executive and judicial branches in America. Wilson entered into office with a clear plan of action. Maybe no president before or since has been as clearly articulated in what he intended to do than Woodrow Wilson was. He was a Democratic progressive. Initially, his plan had very high success. He promised to assault what he called the triple wall of privilege: tariffs, banks, trust, big business, big banking, big trade merchants, those things he said which were really constraining the economy for most Americans. His policy initiatives were referred to collectively as the New Freedom. And that's an important term to know because you might see that term, say, in an excerpt in a paragraph or whatever of a document on an AP exam. So just know that the New Freedom refers to collectively Wilson's domestic policy. He used tariff, currency, and antitrust laws to prime the pump, as he said, to get the economy working again. Here he's seen doing that in this 1918 political cartoon. His actions carried forth the progressive reforms that had heretofore been predominantly located in Americans' urban areas. But one of the things that Wilson did was he carried progressivism out into rural America as well, and into foreign policy more and more also. A stark contrast to the international intervention policies of, especially of Teddy Roosevelt, and to a degree of William Howard Taft. Although, be warned, Wilson was also a big interventionist, just not as aggressively as or as overtly as, say, Teddy Roosevelt was. He signed the 1913 Underwood Tariff Bill, which lowered the cost of imports, which increased American trade. He brought into law the Federal Reserve Act, which is what our current banking system is still based upon. This increased the flow of money in the economy. It established more banks, giving more citizens and businesses, especially small businesses, access to loans and money. And in 1914, he signed major antitrust legislation carrying forward the previous precedent set by Teddy Roosevelt. The Federal Trade Commission Act and the Clayton Antitrust Act both came out of the Woodrow Wilson administration. The Seamen's Act guaranteed working conditions for merchant marines. The Farm Assistant Act increased farm loans and warehouses for farmers to store excess crops. The Highway Construction Bill was really good for rural America as Wilson focused on farm to market roads. Again, all of these things increasing the flow of the American economy, but also many of them aimed at people outside of urban areas. The Workingmen's Compensation Act, which gave disability money for federal workers who were injured on the job, is important. It goes along kind of with the Seamen's Act in that these were major federal programs that would then set a precedent for private industries like the shipping industry or like regular industry that served the same kinds of workers. Once the federal government started upping people's pay, adjusting people's work conditions, offering disability pay, all these things put pressure on private industry to do the same. The Addison Act regulated railroad workers' hours and conditions, and because railroad workers was such a huge part of the American economy at the time, that 8-hour workday that became the standard for the rail industry would help spur other industries to mirror the same. 1916 Child Labor Act did not fully outlaw child labor, but it made huge inroads into that increasingly growing problem of the Gilded Age growth of industry. He was also very socially progressive in some ways, but not in others. In some ways, for example, he nominated Louis Brandeis, who many of us mentioned in our progressive portfolios, to the Supreme Court. That's significant because he's the first Jewish member of the Supreme Court. It is Louis Brandeis for whom Brandeis University in Waltham, Massachusetts is named. That being said, remember that Wilson was a Southerner at the end of the day and notably bigoted. Minorities were notably absent from Woodrow Wilson's progressive reforms. He forced segregation in many government facilities and jobs that had not previously been segregated before Wilson's administration. Wilson, on the same day that he gave a memorial speech at the Gettysburg National Cemetery, which is a 90-minute train ride from Washington, D.C., took a train back after he had spoken at Gettysburg. You know, Lincoln, free the slaves, Gettysburg Address. That Gettysburg, that same day, signed into law the Segregated Forces Act, which segregated by race the American military. Hey, but Woodrow Wilson does have his face on a piece of money. It's the $100,000 bill. Before electronic banking, the $100,000 bill was only used in bank to bank interchanges. So MC Hammer was right. You and me can't touch this. So, what were some of the key elements of Wilson's domestic policy? Take a moment now, pause the video, and get that written down. Summarize that for yourself. Got it? Good. The foreign policy of Woodrow Wilson also represents a evolution of foreign policy under domestic presidents. There are three terms you need to know about domestic era presidents' foreign policy: big stick diplomacy, dollar diplomacy, and moral diplomacy. Teddy Roosevelt, who famously said, walk softly and carry a big stick, was the instigator of big stick diplomacy, using American military might to begin throwing our weight around the world. Remember, Roosevelt, formerly as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, was a big proponent during the era of the Spanish American War of U.S. naval power. William Howard Taft, though, was more of a policy oriented president. He believed in what we call dollar diplomacy, using the growing strength of the American economy to compel alliances around the world. Woodrow Wilson, though, was a high minded moralist. Remember, he was highly educated. He was at one point the president of Princeton University. And so Wilson expounded on what he called moral diplomacy, that the U.S. should look for ways to support democracy and freedom all around the world. Here we see him teaching the little Latin American nations around us about the desire to have democracies, not forceful dictatorships in their countries. Because, of course, democracy and freedom were good things. But at the end of the day, Wilson was also a moral pragmatist in foreign policy and a moral kind of anti imperialist. He repealed the Panama Canal's Tolls Act. This is anti imperialism, which gave less direct control of the U.S. over the Panama Canal, and he made the Philippines a territory rather than a direct protectorate, which meant less U.S. control of the Philippines, more freedom for the Philippines, and he guaranteed independence when the government of the Philippines stabilized. But that unfortunately wouldn't happen for the Philippines until after the Second World War. That being said, Wilson was also an interventionist. He sent Marines to protect American interest in Haiti in 1915. He bought the Virgin Islands from Denmark in 1917, all to protect U.S. business interests to a degree. And then Wilson got involved in some heavy decisions in Mexico. Yeesh, what a mess. America had really heavy interest in Mexico. We had over $1 billion in U.S. investment in Mexico, and 50,000 U.S. citizens lived south of the Rio Grande River. There was a revolution in Mexico which brought a new leader who was promptly murdered by supporters of this guy, General Victoriano Huerta. And this would then spark massive Mexican migration into the United States. Many Americans, especially rich business people, cried out for Wilson to intervene in Mexican affairs because they felt like their business interests could be threatened by the instability of the government and the dictatorial regime of Huerta. Especially loud in this criticism of Wilson was newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst. William Randolph Hearst was the wealthiest publisher in the world. He controlled an enormous amount of the American press. And William Randolph Hearst had several interests in Mexico, including a ranch, just a little old ranch, whose acreage was larger than the state of Rhode Island. Now, look, Wilson at the end of the day was a progressive, and he had no desire to help a big time business tycoon for his little ranch in Mexico like William Randolph Hearst. But he didn't want to tolerate this bloody dictator, right? That went against his morals and moral diplomacy and all that. So what to do, what do? As a side note, one of the most famous and influential American movies of all time was a movie directed by Orson Welles called Citizen Kane. It's the story of a large publishing magnate who does whatever it takes to become wealthy and in the end dies alone with no friends or family around him. The pursuit of money being more important to him than the pursuit of human connection. Now, Orson Welles contended that the similarity between Mr. Kane and the real life Mr. Hearst was coincidental. No, it wasn't really meant to be a criticism of Hearst. That being said, Hearst refused to let any of his papers write anything at all about the movie Citizen Kane. So, what's Wilson to do? I don't want to support big American business people. I don't want a violent dictator just south of my border. So the Wilson administration supports a couple of different rebel groups seeking to overthrow the Huerta regime. An old timey, well known politician from Mexico, Venustiano Carranza, and an old time, a new timey rather, rebel named Francisco Villa, known as Pancho. With all this intervention going on with the U.S., tensions with U.S. and Mexico, Tensions also rose between the U.S. and Germany because Germany was a big supporter of the Huerta regime, and they were supplying arms to Huerta while the U.S. was trying to support these potential rebels, Carranza and Villa. This led the United States to seize the Mexican port of Veracruz to stop the Germans from arming Huerta. This angered Mexico and Germany. It looked like a big conflagration might roll out, but the ABC group, Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, stepped in, brokered a peace between the Americans, the Germans, the Mexicans, and at least the tension between Germany and the U.S. settled for a while. But under this pressure, the Huerta regime collapsed, and the U.S. supported Venustiano Carranza to be installed as the new president. This greatly angered the supporters of Francisco Villa. It would also eventually anger the supporters of Carranza, who saw the U.S., the big neighbor to the north, as meddling in internal Mexican affairs. Villa was angered. Why do we install Carranza and not him? He felt, and his supporters felt, that they were far more responsible for the overthrow of the Huerta regime. So now Francisco Villa will seek to destabilize the Carranza regime. He'll do this by trying to spark a war between the United States and Mexico because tensions were already kind of high. First of all, Francisco Villa and his followers killed 16 U.S. mine workers in Mexico. When the U.S. did not respond with troops, they entered over the border into New Mexico and killed 19 Americans. All right, now you've got a rebel force from a neighboring country entering your territory, killing your citizens. Golly, if that's not an act of war, I don't know what is. So the U.S. will indeed send troops to Mexico. They'll chase Francisco Villa. They'll fail to capture him because eventually the U.S. will get involved in another war, which will take their attention away from Mexico as they withdraw their troops, rather, America does, as war with Germany looms. So, what are the foreign tensions that also shape Wilson's foreign policy in his first administration? The lead up to the First World War starts in the latter part of Wilson's first administration, in particular with the German sinking of the passenger liner Lusitania in 1915. Over 1,000 citizens were killed. Over 100 Americans were aboard that ship. And many people called upon Wilson to declare war on Germany. Our allies in Europe, the French, the British, were at war with Germany. And Germany had just killed Americans on a civilian liner on the open sea. Maybe reasonably called for war. But instead, Wilson, who didn't like the idea of going to war and also recognizing the broad American citizen feeling that we should stay out of other people's problems, right? Don't get involved with OPP, sent simply an official letter of protest to the German government. Now, why was Germany doing this? Well, these maps are kind of weird, but once your eyes adjust, you can see them. So there's Ireland, there's England, right there, right. So there's France, there's Germany, and this is the North Sea. In order to harm Germany at the outset of the war, the British had mined the North Sea, which made all shipping traffic very difficult and dangerous. Because we forget Germany has a huge sea border along the North Sea here, just north of the English Channel, between France and England. So Germany responded to this by this submarine warfare of all British and French liners that came in to the area. And that's what led to Lusitania and other ships after the Lusitania, the Arabic in 1915 when two Americans died, and the Sussex in March of 1916. Wilson administration entered into tough negotiations with the Germans. They agreed to back down, and the US agreed to get the British to break their blockade of the North Sea. Wilson won a significant re-election victory in 1916, built largely on the campaign's slogan that he kept us out of war, which he had up until 1916. Ironically, the year after he was elected, in fact, in January of 1917, before he was re-inaugurated even in March, Germany announced unlimited submarine warfare because the British had indeed not come through on their part of the deal that the U.S. promised we could get them to come through on, and the North Sea remained heavily mined by German military mines. The British blockade remained, and passenger liners at this time were actually routinely used to transport war materials. Now, this does not justify what Germany did to passenger liners. However, it is to point out that countries knowingly placed on passenger ships war materials for shipment, which we could also argue legitimately made them targets of war. But what really tipped the U.S. over the edge was the Zimmerman note. The United States intercepted a German diplomatic note to Mexico which proposed an alliance. Here's an original interpretation of the document right here, right? Because the Germans were worried about the Americans coming into the war, and so their idea was to get Mexico to declare war on Germany, and then that would keep. I'm sorry, keep, don't do that. Get Mexico to declare war Germany. Yes, declare war on us. No, that makes no sense at all. Wait, no, that's not what we meant. Declare war on America. That would get America involved in the war over here, and they would prohibit them from getting into war in Europe. So here we see in part the text of this, right? Um, in the event of this not succeeding, we make Mexico a proposal, an alliance of the following: make war together, make peace together. Generous financial support and an understanding on our part that Mexico is to reconquer the lost territory in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, right? That land, large parts of that land lost in the Mexican American War. So here's Germany essentially egging Mexico into war with America and guaranteeing American land to be given to Mexico. Wow, man, that's not good. That's no bueno. And so Wilson will declare war on Germany just a month after he was reelected in 1917. So the man who got reelected largely because he kept us out of war is about to get us into war shortly after his second inauguration. Okay, so you know the story of the war, trench warfare. We'll get more into this. The good guys win, the other guys lose. Let's jump till after the war. After the war, Wilson goes over to Europe. He is greeted as a hero by European citizens. And he goes to Europe with his 14-point plan, his what many would call idealistic vision of a new world ruled by democracies. His most cherished element of this plan was the 14th point, a general association of nations, come to be known as the League of Nations, the predecessor to our current United Nations. However, European leaders were not nearly as high minded. Well, they may have been as high minded, but they were not as idealistic as the US president was. These are leaders of nations who had for centuries been at war with each other, who fought what had been by far the bloodiest war in world history for 4 years, and which the Americans had gotten into at the end just for one. They wanted revenge, they wanted compensation. However, they did agree with the idea of the League of Nations, and that was the only one of Wilson's 14 points that was ratified in the Treaty of Versailles. Ironically, and some might even say tragically, that element of Versailles specifically was not accepted by many politicians at home. To ratify a treaty, a president needs two-thirds of a majority of Congress. And the League of Nations provisions worried many Americans, including those in Congress, who feared the loss of American sovereignty. Oh, no. We get involved in the League of Nations. Now we're just going to get involved in a bunch of treaties, just like the intertwined treaties that got the Europeans into war to begin with. And remember, Wilson's a Democrat. Congress was still controlled by Republicans. And this guy in particular, Henry Cabot Lodge, led the opposition to the Treaty of Versailles. Lodge led a group of senators who were willing to accept the treaty if some reservations, especially around the League of Nations, were added to it. But Wilson thought he could appeal to the public, and he went for full ratification. Taking his case to the people, he trained around the country, giving speech after speech, eventually exhausting himself, collapsing in Colorado, and suffering a massive stroke a few days later. With Wilson out of the picture, the Republicans in Congress, here we see Henry Cabot Lodge escorting the highly damaged Treaty of Versailles out of a congressional hearing room, would in the end carry the day. The Senate voted three different times for the Treaty of Versailles, both as it was presented and with suggested American reservations, but all three times they rejected. Ironically, Wilson directed his most loyal supporters to vote against the treaty version with reservations, which meant that those who would have otherwise supported the treaty with Wilson ended up siding with the most staunchly opposed Republicans. Those Republicans, led by Lodge, who wanted the treaty with reservations, were essentially centrist Republicans. There were even more conservative Republicans who didn't want any part of the treaty in any form. And so instead of siding with these centrist Republicans, which would have maybe arguably been easier, Wilson essentially made a bad call, and his most staunch supporters ended up siding in terms of the treaty vote with his most staunch enemies. The U.S. would never join the League of Nations. We would make a separate peace with the German nation in 1921. As you see here, the League of Nations with the missing U.S. keystone here in the middle. And so you can compare Wilson's post-war goals with the actual outcome of American policy. What factors served to shape the difference between those goals and his reality? And as you complete your reflection, we will end the chapter 21 notes. Have a good weekend, y'all.